The most unsettling deep woods encounters ever reported. Creepypasta. The first thing you need to understand is that I'm not someone who gets scared easily. And I say that not to sound tough, but because it's relevant to the story. It matters that I went into those woods as a person who had spent the better part of 6 years working in remote environments, who had done fire watch rotations in the Cascades, who had helped with ungulate surveys in country so far off any road that the nearest person with a radio was 4 hours away on foot. I'm telling you that because what happened out there didn't happen to someone who was naive about the wilderness or prone to letting their imagination run. It happened to someone who knew better, which is the part I haven't quite found a way to make peace with. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that in the late spring of a year I'm going to keep deliberately vague, I took a seasonal contract position with a forestry management outfit operating out of a small field office in the upper reaches of a watershed I'd never worked before. The drainage was in a part of the country where logging had gone through in one big industrial wave decades before, and then largely stopped, leaving behind a forest that was neither old growth nor young growth, but something in between, a place in that awkward adolescent stage where the trees are tall enough to block the sky, but not old enough to have the spacing and understory structure that makes a forest feel genuinely inhabited. You know the kind of place I mean. Quiet in a way that feels less like peace and more like absence. The contract was for monitoring. Specifically, I was part of a small crew tasked with deploying and servicing acoustic monitoring units, battery-powered recording devices mounted at specific GPS coordinates throughout the drainage, set to capture ambient soundscapes on a rolling schedule. The data was going to a university research team studying acoustic ecology, which is the science of using sound to understand the health and biodiversity of an environment. What bird species are present and when? Whether the insect populations are what they should be. Whether the soundscape of a recovering forest is recovering on the same timeline as its visible, measurable components, or whether something subtler is lagging behind. It's painstaking work and largely unglamorous, which meant the crew was small and the pay was adequate, but not generous. And the people willing to do it tended to be a particular type, experienced in solitude, comfortable with routine, not especially interested in conversation for its own sake. There were 3 of us assigned to that drainage that season. Myself, a woman named Corrigan, who had a background in environmental audio, and who I had never met before the first day, and a man I'll call Deaver, which is close enough to his actual name that I'll remember I'm talking about him when I read this back. Deaver was the senior technician. He'd worked the drainage the previous 2 seasons and was technically our field lead, though the hierarchy was loose enough that it rarely came up. He was one of those people who communicates almost entirely through what he does, rather than what he says competent, in a quiet and total way that you only really recognize in retrospect, when you realize you've been taking cues from someone without ever consciously deciding to. In 6 days of working alongside him before the incident, I don't think he said more than 300 words total. But if he moved toward something, you moved toward it. If he stopped and held still, you stopped and held still. That kind of person. The work itself had a rhythm that was easy to settle into. We'd drive as far into the drainage as the road allowed, which was not far. Most of the access tracks were decommissioned and partially reclaimed, passable in a high-clearance truck for the first 2 or 3 kilometers, and then impassable. And from the end of the road, we'd go on foot, carrying what we needed for the day in frame packs. Each monitoring unit needed to be checked every 10 to 12 days. The memory cards swapped out, the batteries tested, the housing inspected for moisture or animal damage. The units were spread across an area that was large enough that we couldn't service them all in a single day, so the rotation was planned in advance, and each day had a predetermined route and set of target units. Deaver had set the routes. He explained them once, on the first morning, standing over a topographic printout spread on the hood of the truck, tracing the lines with a finger that was missing part of its tip from something he'd never explained. He showed us the boundaries of the survey area. He told us which drainages within the drainage were in scope and which were out of scope. He pointed to a section of the map to the northeast, a tributary that fed into the main creek at roughly the 60% mark of the watershed. And he said, without any particular emphasis, that we don't work that side of the creek. Not that tributary, not the slope above it, not the bench north of the ridgeline visible from the main trunk trail. Corrigan asked why. Deaver said the units weren't placed there. She said right. But why aren't the units placed there? He looked at the map for a moment. Then he said the terrain was unstable, that there'd been a slide event the previous winter, and the slope was unpredictable and not worth the liability. He said it in a way that was technically responsive to her question, but that didn't quite feel like an answer. And both of us understood the distinction without saying so. Corrigan let it go. I let it go. The map had enough area within bounds to keep us busy for the entire contract, and there was no particular reason to push on it. We worked. The days had a structure that was almost meditative once you got into it. Early start, long miles, methodical work at each unit, long miles back, late return to the field office, which was just a converted ranger station with a kitchenette and 4 cots and a whiteboard on which Deaver tracked the service schedule in a handwriting that was unexpectedly neat. Evenings were quiet. Corrigan would spend an hour reviewing data on her laptop before lights out. Deaver would go outside for a while, not for long, 20 minutes or so, and then come back in and go to bed without comment. I'd write notes in a field journal that I kept more out of habit than any real plan. By 9:30 or 10, the building was dark and silent. The thing I liked most about those early days was the sound of the forest itself. I know that sounds like the setup to something, and I suppose it is. But I want to be precise about it before it changes. In a healthy stretch of that kind of mid-succession forest, in late spring, the acoustic environment has a specific character. There's bird activity that's densest in the 2 hours after sunrise, drops off through midday, and picks back up in the evening. And it's not just volume, but variety, the overlapping territories of different species. The way sound carries differently depending on the density of the canopy and the moisture in the air and the gradient of the slope. Underneath that, running almost below conscious awareness, there's insect sound and wind in the needles, and the occasional creak noise when you're near water, and the sound of your own movement through a brush, which, if you stop to notice it, disappears in a way that makes the silence underneath suddenly very large. I spent a lot of those first days just listening. That was part of the job. In a way, acoustic ecology means paying attention to what you hear, not just what the devices record. Which is why I noticed, before anything else happened, that the northeast tributary drainage sounded different. You couldn't hear it from most of the survey area. The ridgeline between that drainage and the main creek was substantial enough that sound didn't carry across it in any meaningful way. But there was one point on the main trunk trail, near the junction where the trail bent northwest to follow the contour of the hillside, where the topography funneled noise in a particular direction. And if you stood at that point and faced east, you were facing directly down the axis of the excluded tributary. I discovered this on day 4, on my way back from servicing a cluster of units near the upper margin of the survey area. I had stopped to adjust my pack straps, and I noticed that the sound from that direction was not the sound from any other direction. It wasn't louder. It wasn't frightening, or not in any way I could have articulated. It was just different in quality, less layered somehow. As though whatever acoustic complexity was present in the rest of the drainage had been sorted out or strained, leaving something simpler and more regular underneath. like listening to a recording of a forest rather than a forest. I stood there for probably 2 minutes. Then I adjusted my pack and kept walking and put it out of my mind mostly. The 6th day of the contract was the one that matters. I should say before I get into it that what I did was not stupid. I want to be clear about that, not to defend myself. I've had time enough to move past self-defense. But because the story doesn't work if you think I was careless or naive. What I did was grounded in a legitimate professional judgment that any experienced field technician would have understood and probably made the same way in the same circumstances. Corrigan had a family situation come up and left for 3 days. That reduced the crew to 2, which pushed our service schedule out by a day on the units she'd been responsible for. And it created a time conflict on the 6th day between a cluster of units in the western section that Deaver was handling and a single unit, Unit 34, that was positioned at the easternmost edge of the survey area, close to the ridgeline. Unit 34 was overdue for service. Its memory card was past the exchange window, and the data from it was part of a time-sensitive segment of the study period. Losing another day on it would have created a gap in the acoustic record that the university team had specifically flagged as problematic. I had the coordinates. The unit was within bounds, close to the boundary but within it. The route was one I hadn't done alone, but had done twice with Deaver and knew well enough. And the forecast was clear, which in that drainage in that season was not something you took for granted. Deaver looked at the schedule. He looked at the map. He looked at me. He said, "That unit is close to the ridgeline." I said I knew that. He said to stay on the trail until the unit, don't take any shortcuts across the slope, and to be back at the trailhead by 3 regardless of whether I'd finished. I said fine. He said it again. By 3. Not 3:30, not close to 3. 3. I said I understood. He held the look for a moment, which was not a suspicious look or a warning look in any melodramatic sense. It was the look of someone making sure that what they said had actually landed. Then he packed his own gear and we drove the access track together and split at the trailhead and went in opposite directions. The morning was clear in the way that the 6th week of spring can be clear in high country light that's almost white. Thin air that makes everything slightly sharper than expected. A chill at the edges that the sun hadn't quite burned off yet. I made good time on the trail, which was familiar enough that I could walk it at a reasonable pace without having to check the GPS more than every 20 minutes or so. The forest on this side of the drainage was slightly older than the rest of the survey area. The logging had gone through later here, or not as thoroughly, and there were occasional trees of a real size, their bark ridged and reddish in the morning light, the spacing around them wider than the younger growth. The understory opened up. Sound carried further. Unit 34 was right where it was supposed to be, bolted to a lodgepole about 15 meters off the trail on the eastern side, exactly at the coordinates. I reached it before 10 in the morning, which left me with comfortable time. I swapped the memory card, ran the battery diagnostic, noted a small crack in the housing gasket that I photographed and flagged in my field notes for replacement, and was back on the trail by 10:20. I was 20 minutes down the trail heading back when I realized the card case was missing. The card case was a hard-sided plastic container about the size of a deck of cards that held the memory cards I'd already pulled from units, the ones with the current data on them. Not the new cards, not the equipment. The old cards, the data. I'd had it in my chest pocket, and it was gone. And when I went through my pack and my pockets methodically, which I did, twice, still standing on the trail, it wasn't there. I knew immediately where it was. I'd set it on a route beside the lodgepole while I was working on Unit 34, because the housing was finicky, and I'd needed both hands, and I had not picked it back up. I turned around. I walked back to Unit 34. The card case was exactly where I'd left it, sitting on the root, half covered by a flake of bark that had fallen on it, which is why I hadn't noticed its absence as quickly as I should have. I picked it up, put it in my hip pocket this time, and looked at my watch. 10:53. Standing at the base of the lodgepole, facing the unit to confirm I hadn't left anything else, I could see the ridgeline for the first time clearly. The morning's angled light had moved around by now, and the ridge was lit directly, and I could see the shape of the terrain above the slope, above the trail, the rocky outcrops near the crest, and through a natural gap between two formations, a corridor of trees descending into the drainage on the other side. The northeast tributary drainage, the excluded area. I didn't go in. I want to be precise about that. What I did, and I want to be honest about this because it matters, is that I walked up the slope toward the gap, not through it, not into the other drainage. I walked up the slope maybe 70 meters of climbing, through open terrain, nothing that Deaver had explicitly told me not to do, because the prohibition was about the drainage and the slope above the tributary and the bench north of the ridgeline, not the ridgeline itself. And I stood at the gap between the formations, and I looked down into the drainage below. I told myself I was looking at the terrain to understand Deaver's stability concern, and I believe I half believed that at the time. The real reason was the sound. I could hear it from the trail when I'd been standing at the lodgepole. The same quality I'd noticed before at the junction point, that flattened, sordid acoustic texture, like something had been removed from the soundscape rather than added to it. From higher on the slope it was stronger, more directional, and standing at the gap, looking down, I could hear it very clearly. And I want to be careful about how I describe it, because I don't want to make it into something it wasn't, not at that stage. What it sounded like was a forest with one layer of sound missing. Not silent, not wrong in any way that would have alarmed an untrained person, just organized differently. The bird sound was present, but without the territorial variation you'd expect a consistent type, consistently spaced, at a regular interval that felt more like a broadcast than like a living acoustic environment. I stood there for somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes, looking down into the drainage. The trees were close spaced, and the slope dropped away steeply, which was consistent with Deaver's slide explanation. And there was no obvious damage or evidence of instability from where I was standing, but I wasn't a geomorphologist and wouldn't have necessarily recognized it if there were. I looked at my watch. 11:22. I started back down the slope. On the trail, heading west, the sound dropped away behind me. The normal acoustic environment returned with a normalcy that made the absence more noticeable in retrospect, the way you only feel a low-grade pressure in your sinuses when it releases. I walked at a good clip. I was not unsettled. I want to be clear about that, not yet. I was thinking about the card case and whether the gasket on Unit 34's housing was bad enough to flag as urgent. And I was listening to the forest the way you do when it's what your job has trained you to do. And I was planning what I'd say to Deaver about the detour if he asked. He didn't ask. I was back at the trailhead at 1:47, well ahead of 3. And we drove back to the station without much conversation. At dinner, we cooked in rotation, and it was my turn, which meant pasta and canned tomatoes, because I'm not imaginative with camp food. Deaver said the western units had been in worse condition than expected, 2 of them showing moisture ingress, and that he'd have to go back the following day. I said Unit 34's gasket needed replacing. He noted it on the whiteboard. We went to bed. Corrigan came back on day 8. This is the part that's harder to explain. She seemed fine when she arrived. Quieter than before. she'd had a family situation, she'd said. And she'd been tired when she left, but the nature of field work is that people carry things without putting them down. And quiet in someone who was already relatively quiet wasn't a diagnostic indicator of anything. She sorted her gear, checked the service schedule, confirmed her rotation, ate dinner. Normal. I noticed that she seemed to look at the map differently that evening, standing at the whiteboard for longer than she usually did. But I chalked that up to getting her bearings after a few days away. Deaver glanced at her once while she was standing there and then went back to whatever he was doing, which was sharpening a folding knife in the manner of someone who was doing it primarily to have something to do with his hands. The next morning, day 9, we split for our respective routes. Corrigan's route that day went to the eastern section, toward the upper units, which put her on the trail segment near the junction point, the place where you could hear the difference in the sound from the excluded tributary. I thought about that when she left. Not with any particular alarm, just a noting. She didn't come back that afternoon. By 4:30, Deaver was outside. By 5, he had called the coordinates in on the radio, not a search and rescue call, just a welfare check request to the Forestry Service dispatch, who maintained contact with field crews in the drainage. By 7, he had his pack on. By 7:15, I had mine on too. We went back up the trail together without discussing whether we were going or what we expected to find. The evening light in the high country in late spring lasts longer than you expect. By 8, it was still light enough to move at reasonable speed on a familiar trail. By 8:30, the quality of the light had changed, not dark, but that threshold amber where shadows start to tell you things the light doesn't, and we were moving slower. Deaver had a headlamp but didn't use it yet. We found her pack at the junction point. Just her pack. Leaning against a tree on the east side of the trail, the hip belt undone, as if she'd taken it off to adjust something and stepped away and not come back. Both frame straps were still fastened at the top, which you don't usually do if you're taking a pack off voluntarily, because you unfasten from the top down. That was the first thing I noticed. The second thing was that the side pockets were intact. Her GPS was still in the left one. Her emergency whistle still attached to the shoulder strap, which ruled out certain explanations without offering others. Deaver stood in front of the pack for about 30 seconds. He didn't touch it. He looked at the trail east and west, and then he turned and looked up the slope toward the ridgeline, which from the junction point you could see as a dark, irregular line against the last of the sky. He said quietly and without drama, "She went over the ridge." I asked how he knew. He didn't answer. He took his headlamp out and put it on. Then he said we were going to wait right here on the trail until daylight. Not go up the slope, not go over. Wait. I asked what we were waiting for. He looked at me. His expression in the headlamp light was not frightened. I want to be very exact about this. It was the expression of someone who has already done the calculation and arrived at the answer and is now living in what the answer means, which is a different thing from fear, more contained. He said, "If she comes back, she'll come back down the trail." The subtext of that sentence did not escape me. We sat on the trail. Deaver with his back against Corrigan's pack tree, me with my back against the opposite slope. He turned his headlamp off to preserve the battery, and we sat in the near dark, which was not completely dark. The sky held light well past what the canopy let through. And your eyes adjusted, and the trail was a visible gray channel between the tree shapes on either side. We didn't talk much. Deaver once said, without preamble, that he'd worked a drainage in Oregon 5 years back where a similar situation had come up, and that the person involved had come back 3 days later with no memory of where they'd been. He said it in the tone of someone who knew that story was technically reassuring and was offering it while being aware that it was not the only version of the story. I said, "What's the other version?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She doesn't come back, or she comes back different." "Different how?" I said. He said he didn't know exactly. He said the Oregon person had been different in ways that were hard to categorize. Not wrong in any specific, legible way, just different. The way a copy of something is different from the original, even when all the content is there. That he'd assumed at the time it was trauma response. That he was less sure about that now. I thought about the sound from the tributary drainage. The acoustic texture that was like a recording rather than a thing. I thought about copies. Around midnight, something called from the direction of the ridge. Not an animal call. Not exactly I've heard every owl and coyote and elk vocalization that occurs in that country. And this was not cleanly any of those, though it had elements of a few. What it reminded me of, most precisely, was the sound of a voice heard through a radio in poor signal conditions. When the words are almost there, but the medium itself is interfering. And what reaches you is a pattern of inflection without enough content to parse as language. It was that, shaped but not resolved, coming from somewhere above us and to the east. Deaver was completely still, not rigid still in the deliberate way of someone who had made a choice and was holding it. His breathing was audible and even. The sound came twice more in the next hour, with varying intervals. Each time slightly different, not louder, not closer in any clear way, but more specific. The second time, I thought I could almost hear something in the inflection that was shaped like a name. I do not know whose name. I thought probably mine or Deaver's. But that may have been the night and the stillness and the willingness to interpret that comes with both. The third time it came, I started to stand up. I don't know that I'd made a decision. I'm not sure there was a decision exactly. It was more like the sound produced a response in my body that my mind wasn't fully involved in making the physical inclination to orient toward it and move. The way you turn toward a voice in a crowd without deciding to. I got my weight off the ground and onto my feet, and I was about to take a step up the slope when Deaver put his hand on my arm. Not grabbing, just contact. The same quality as the rest of his communication information conveyed through what he does, without language. I stopped. We stood, I was standing. He was still sitting, his hand on my forearm, until the inclination passed. I'm not sure how long that took. Long enough that I became aware of how cold it had gotten, which I hadn't noticed while I was warm from the impulse to move. I sat back down. Deaver moved his hand. Neither of us said anything. After that, the sound didn't come again. The forest resumed its nighttime business, which in late spring in that drainage was enough life insects, occasional bird calls, creek sound from below to fill the silence without quite erasing it. I stayed awake. Deaver may have slept, I'm not sure. At some point the sky above the canopy went from deep to dim to a uniform gray-white that meant the sun was coming without being visible yet. And birds started, and Deaver stood. And without speaking, we both understood we were leaving. Corrigan's pack was still leaning against the tree. We walked out to the trailhead without stopping. It was full light by the time we reached the truck. Deaver made one radio call from the cab, brief and technical, giving Corrigan's last known location and requesting a formal search. Then he drove to the field station, made coffee, and sat down at the table. I sat across from him. After a while, I said, "What would have happened if I'd gone up the slope?" He looked at his coffee. He said he didn't know. He said he thought probably nothing good. I said, "You've known this drainage is wrong from the beginning." He didn't deny it. He said every drainage has a point past which it doesn't behave the way terrain is supposed to behave, and that most of them you learn by working near them long enough, and that the trick is not pretending the point doesn't exist, but also not pretending you understand what it means. He said the rules about the Northeast tributary weren't his rules. Originally, they'd come from the field crew the season before him, passed informally, and he'd come to understand why they existed through proximity rather than through anything being explained. I said, "Why didn't you explain them to us?" He thought about this. He said he didn't have the language for it that wouldn't sound like something a person should investigate rather than avoid. That the explanation would have made it more compelling rather than less. That the rules only work if they don't come with a reason attached, because a reason is an invitation to test whether the reason is the real reason. I sat with that for a while. It's the most coherent account of why that category of rule exists that I've ever heard, and it's the one I keep coming back to when I think about the whole thing. The search ran for 5 days. Formal search and rescue, with dogs and helicopters and 24 people working the drainage. They found no trace of Corrigan within the bounds of the search area, which I later learned from the incident report did not include the Northeast tributary drainage. When I asked the SAR coordinator about that, she told me the terrain there was considered too unstable for search personnel, and that a hazard assessment had indicated high risk of further slide movement. She said it with the fluency of someone repeating something they'd been told, rather than something they'd assessed themselves. I did not push on it. I thought about what Deaver had said, about explanations being invitations, and I let it go. I finished the contract. Deaver finished the contract. We serviced every remaining unit within the survey bounds and submitted complete data to the university research team and received a formal acknowledgement of deliverables met. Nobody from the university asked about the gap in the acoustic record from the Northeast tributary, because there had never been any acoustic monitoring units in the Northeast tributary. And so as far as the record was concerned, it simply wasn't part of the study. Which I suppose it wasn't. The last day of the contract, loading equipment into the truck, Deaver handed me the topographic printout that had been pinned above his cot for the whole season. He'd marked it. I noticed not the survey area, not the route lines, but the Northeast tributary drainage. Not marked as in annotated, marked as in a single horizontal line drawn across it in pencil, the way you cross something out on a list. The kind of mark that's less a notation and more a practice. A reminder that something has been accounted for, without specifying what the accounting means. He drove away first. I stood by the truck for a few minutes, looking at the drainage through the trees at the end of the access road. It was a warm day, the warmest of the season, and the forest had that late spring density of sound that in any other context I would have just appreciated as pleasant. Bird populations at their peak, insects in the leaf litter, a creek running full with snowmelt. From the access road, 2 kilometers from the junction point and further still from the ridgeline, I could not have heard anything from the Northeast tributary. That's not a technical opinion. It's a physical fact. The terrain, the distance, the ambient noise of the surrounding forest, all of it together makes it acoustically impossible. I know that. What I heard anyway, or what I think I heard, or what I have been telling myself I heard for long enough that I'm no longer sure of the distinction, was very faint and very regular and shaped like the forest without being the forest. And underneath it once, something that might have been arranged around the pattern of a name. Not my name, someone else's. I got in the truck and drove out and did not look back at the drainage. I filed my incident notes when I got home. I answered the formal questions from the investigation into Corrigan's disappearance, which were few and procedural, and seemed designed more to close the file than to open it. I described my route on day 6, including the time I spent at Unit 34. And I described the return to the trailhead. I did not describe the 70 meters of slope I climbed to stand at the gap in the ridgeline formation. Not because I thought it was relevant to what happened to her. I don't think it was. I don't think those things are linked in any causal way I can demonstrate, but because I couldn't frame it in the language of an official incident report without it sounding either like something it wasn't or like something I couldn't explain. And both of those would have done more harm than silence. I have thought about Corrigan a great deal since then. Not in the way of grief exactly, because grief requires a kind of certainty about the loss that I don't quite have. The investigation is technically still open, I believe, though I haven't checked in over a year. What I think about is whether there was a point before which something was preventable. Not by me necessarily, not even by Deaver. But somewhere in the chain of decisions that put a crew of 3 people into that drainage, with a set of inherited rules passed informally and without explanation. To do work that required one of us to spend time alone near the boundary of a zone that behaved differently from everywhere else. Somewhere in that chain, something was organized in a way that should have been organized differently. I don't know if that's a comforting thought or a disturbing one. I think it might be both. The thing I keep returning to, the image that surfaces when I wake up at 3 in the morning in the specific, not quite awake state that I've come to associate with this, is not the sound from the ridge, and not Corrigan's pack leaning against the tree with the hip belt undone, though both of those are present in their own way. What I keep returning to is standing at the gap in the ridgeline, with the slope dropping away below me and the trees close-spaced, and the light coming at an angle that made the drainage below simultaneously very visible and very deep, and listening to a soundscape that was assembled from the right components in the wrong configuration. All the pieces present, nothing missing in any way you could immediately name, just organized by something that was not the same thing that organized the forest on the other side of that ridge. I've worked 6 subsequent contracts, 3 of them in forest environments, 2 in high desert, 1 on the coast. I'm a careful listener. It's a professional habit, and also, now, something else, a continuous low-level monitoring that runs underneath the work, the way the creek sound ran underneath everything else. In that drainage. Most places sound exactly like what they are. Occasionally, they sound like what they used to be. In my experience, which is not a small amount of experience, a place sounds like neither of those things extremely rarely. When it happens, when I'm somewhere that has that quality, that assembled from parts absence of the thing underneath the thing, I do what Deaver did. I mark it on whatever map I'm working with. I don't annotate it. I don't investigate it. I draw a line across it, and I note the edge, and I keep my roots away from the boundary, and I don't try to develop language for it, because Deaver was right about that. The language makes it compelling. The compelling makes you move toward it. And some things, I've come to understand, are not oriented toward the people who move away from them. They're oriented toward the people who move closer. Corrigan moved closer. I think she heard the sound from the junction point, the same quality I'd noticed. And I think her particular kind of intelligence, which was thorough and genuinely curious, and professionally trained to pay attention to exactly that kind of acoustic anomaly, I think that intelligence was not a protection. I think it was an opening. I'm not saying that to shift responsibility. I'm not saying it means anything actionable, or that there was a better set of choices available to her in the situation as it existed. I'm saying it because it's the most honest account I have of what I believe happened. And because the alternative, that it was random, that it was terrain, that she slipped on an unstable slope and there's simply no body to find, requires me to explain the sound. And the sound on the night we sat by her pack. that shaped and almost resolved broadcast from above the ridge, did not sound like terrain. It sounded like something that had recently acquired a great deal of information about how to sound like a person, and was still working on the resolution. I said at the beginning that I'm not someone who gets scared easily, and I stand by that. What I am now, that I wasn't before that season, is someone who gets still very easily. Someone who, upon noticing that a place has a quality that isn't quite right in any specific, nameable way, stops walking and checks their watch and calculates the distance back to the trailhead and moves in that direction without making it a decision. Someone who has learned that instinct and expertise are different tools for different situations, and that in a situation where your expertise is in the very process of making you curious about something, your expertise has become a liability. The drainage is still being monitored, I assume. The contract recurred the following season. I don't know who took it. I thought about reaching out to whoever was placed as field lead to say something about the Northeast tributary, about the rules, but I kept running up against the same problem Deaver identified. The explanation is an invitation. The closer I got to a version of the warning that accurately conveyed what I knew, the more it sounded like something you'd want to go and verify. And verification, in this case, is not a safe process. So I said nothing. I don't know if that was the right choice. I don't think there was a right choice in the available options, which is a different thing and something I've had to become comfortable with. Some situations don't offer a path through that leaves everything intact on the other side. The best you can do is understand which things you're putting at risk and whether they're yours to risk, and make the call, and then do the much longer and more difficult work of living in what you chose. I keep the topographic printout, the one Deaver gave me on the last day, with a single penciled line across the northeastern drainage. I keep it folded in my field kit, underneath the spare memory cards and the battery tester and the laminated emergency contact sheet. I don't take it out often. But in new drainages, in new country, when I'm getting my bearings at the start of a contract and laying out the map on a truck hood or a tailgate and learning the shape of the place I'll be working for the next weeks, I sometimes unfold it and put it next to the new map, not for any operational reason, just as a kind of reference point, a baseline. The thing about a penciled line is that it doesn't explain anything. It just marks the edge. It says, here is the boundary of the territory that's been considered. What's past it hasn't been considered, not in any formal way. And you should factor that into your movement and your planning. And you should not feel the need to know more than that. I've found that a useful model for other things too, though I'm not sure I mean that as a comfort. The sound was real. Corrigan is gone. The drainage is there right now, as you're hearing this, running through its full cycle of seasons, the way terrain does, whether or not anyone is working in it, making its sounds, in the way that whatever organizes the sounds in that tributary decides to organize them, cycling through patterns I can't describe accurately, because I only heard them in the dark on one night, and my attention was divided. I think about her sometimes in the early mornings when the light is the kind that comes through a window and falls across a floor without anyone having put it there, and the day hasn't organized itself yet, and everything is still in the pre-structured state where it could become anything. I think about her intelligence and her curiosity and the way those things, in the right circumstances, with the right acoustic anomaly at exactly the right distance, stopped being assets. I don't know what it offered her to make her go. I don't know if it offered anything, or if the offering is a story I'm telling myself to make the geometry of it make sense, someone going towards something rather than simply going. I hope it offered something. I hope whatever she heard at the junction point, whatever resolution the broadcast finally arrived at, was sufficient, was worth the distance. I don't actually believe that, but I hope it. That's the whole account. That's everything I have in any form I can actually hand to somebody. The rest of it is in a drawer somewhere, or in the shape of a sound I can't reproduce, or in the penciled line on a folded piece of paper that I carry from drainage to drainage, through work I still do and intend to keep doing, carefully, within bounds, by 3, and not looking back at the ridge on the way out. You get used to carrying things without putting them down. That's what the work teaches you, more than anything else. You get used to it, and then you get good at it. And then one day, you notice you're not sure anymore what it would feel like to set it down. And by that point, it doesn't really matter, because you're not going to. The map has a line on it. The line marks the edge. You stay on this side of the line. That's the rule. That's always been the rule. And now you know it, which means you know the other thing too. The thing Deaver told me about explanations and invitations. So take that knowledge, for whatever it's worth to you, and be deliberate about what you do with it. And think carefully about how curious you're willing to let yourself be about the drainage on the other side of someone else's penciled boundary. Some rules hold because the people who made them had reasons. Some rules hold because the people who made them knew that reasons are the thing that makes a boundary porous. The rule holds. The drainage doesn't care. Go carefully.